What could these be, I wonder? If you'd like to know, then stick around until the end of the video. On December 22nd, I released something called the Amai Challenge. The objective of the challenge is to kill a specific student who is surrounded by witnesses and dispose of her body without alarming anyone. The purpose of the challenge was to give me an opportunity to observe what players would do if they were given an objective, but were not given clear instructions on how to complete that objective. I wanted to see if players would get frustrated by a lack of direction, or if they would have fun searching for a solution through experimentation. I wanted to see if each player would have a drastically different experience, or if everyone would gravitate towards one strategy. I was pleasantly surprised to see that almost every player approached the Amai Challenge in a different way. Some of them used their knowledge of the game's mechanics to carefully plan Amai's death, while others used trial and error until they found a valid strategy, and a few even discovered clever exploits that I had completely overlooked. Watching people play the Amai Challenge was an incredibly educational experience for me, because it showed me what aspects of the game were frustrating to players and what kind of additions the game needed in order to provide a better experience. That's what led to the wave of new features that were added back in January. But it didn't stop there. The Amai Challenge also helped me to realize something important about the overall experience of playing Yandere Simulator. As I was observing players attempt to beat the challenge, I saw them doing a lot of things that they never did during Osana's week. I saw players exercising caution and using stealth. I saw players improvising in creative ways when things didn't go according to plan. I saw players studying each other's videos in order to compete for the fastest possible time. In short, I saw people having a completely different type of experience than they had with Osana's week. It was an experience based around using the game's mechanics in clever ways, rather than purchasing a walkthrough from InfoChan and following a set of steps. An experience characterized by experimenting and improvising, rather than watching scripted events with voice acting and motion-captured animations. When I watched people play the Amai Challenge, I felt like I was watching people play the game I had originally envisioned back at the very beginning of development, before Yandere Simulator evolved into a completely different type of project. It was an eye-opening experience for me, because it reminded me of what kind of gameplay I originally intended to provide, and it showed me that Osana's week was failing to provide that type of experience. And I know exactly why. It all comes down to one character specifically: Raibaru. Raibaru is Osana's best friend, and the two of them travel everywhere together. In terms of game design, the purpose of Raibaru is to make sure that there is always at least one witness nearby Osana, so that eliminating Osana is never as easy as simply running up to her and stabbing her with zero consequence. Raibaru was given the ability to counter the player's attacks in order to force the player to come up with a more creative way to dispose of her than simply stabbing her. The idea of a character that follows another character, or a character that is immune to direct attack, are not bad ideas by themselves. However, the way that I executed those ideas with Raibaru was very flawed. Yandere Simulator is supposed to be a stealth game about manipulating characters, sometimes by pretending to be their friend, and other times by using distractions. But I didn't want the player to eliminate Raibaru too easily, so I programmed her to be unaffected by most of the mechanics that are used to manipulate characters. For example, Raibaru ignores suspicious objects on the ground. Raibaru ignores audio distractions, such as radios. And Raibaru even ignores you if you try to talk to her. There are only 4 ways to get rid of her, and each of those methods involves a scripted event, rather than using any of the game's core mechanics. That's why the Amai challenge was so much more satisfying than eliminating Osana, because Amai is eliminated through clever use of the game's features rather than scripted events. The first level of a game is supposed to introduce the player to the core mechanics they'll be using for the rest of the game, and teach them how they should try to approach the game's obstacles. Raibaru does the opposite. She teaches the player that the game's mechanics are pointless, and that using scripted events is the only viable way to solve problems. Once I realized how badly Raibaru was ruining the overall experience of eliminating Osana, I knew what had to be done. I had to completely redesign Raibaru and make Osana's week much more like the Amai challenge. So, here are the changes I've made. Raibaru will now investigate distractions, such as giggles, radios, and bang snaps. The player can now talk to Raibaru at any time. And Raibaru will now drop whatever she's doing when she spots something suspicious on the ground. I also made a handful of other adjustments that have nothing to do with gameplay, but make Raibaru a bit more likable as a character. She will now walk beside Osana instead of walking directly behind her like a pet dog. She will now show concern when listening to Yandere-chan and Osana talk about Osana's stalker, instead of just standing there like an emotionless statue. And her reputation has been lowered so that getting rid of her by gossiping about her is far less tedious. Now that Raibaru is much less of an obstacle, you might think that Osana must be easier to eliminate now. But that's not exactly true. I've made Raibaru less of a threat, but in exchange, I have made the rest of the school much more of a threat. If you play the latest build of the game, you'll notice a lot of major differences in the routines of most students. Many students now spend their time socializing with one another along the path that Osana takes throughout the school. You can easily get Raibaru away from Osana, but Osana will always be within the cone of vision of at least 2 other students. This means that if you want to eliminate Osana without any witnesses, you'll have to pick a place to eliminate her, get rid of the witnesses in that area, distract Raibaru at just the right moment, and then eliminate Osana with perfect timing. This kind of stealthy, cautious gameplay represents what I originally had in mind for Yandere Simulator, way back at the very beginning of the game's development. Of course, scripted events will still be present in the game as options, but moving forward, I'd like to make sure that it's always possible to eliminate the rivals exclusively using the game's core mechanics, as long as the player is willing to take the time to master the game's features. Feel free to download the latest build of the game and try to kill Osana outside of her scripted events. Let me know if it feels too easy, too frustrating, or just right. In a few days, we will arrive at the 7th anniversary of Yandere Simulator's development. I fully acknowledge that it's unusual for a game to be in production for such a long time. It's a subject that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'd like to make a video to share my thoughts with you. That video will probably come out shortly after I announce the results of the Medibang Art Contest, which is ending on April 5th.